comes to trying to understand the scope and scale of sexual assault is trying to tease out the marital rape, so rape that's happening within the intimate relationship, and then it's particularly within marriage arrangements, and I'm talking people who have a marital contract, not just people who are cohabiting or partnered, as well as rape that happens in relationships, versus that acquaintance or stranger rape. And we know from, especially from the sexual experiences survey and triangulating with other research, we know that this is in fact a really small percentage, probably less than 20% of sexual assault. You know, that stereotype of the guy jumping out of the bushes or attacking you in a parking garage or something like that. I mean, the generous estimate would that it would be 20% of rapes. A lot of scholars think, in fact, that's even fewer, maybe 10% of rapes would really be some stranger, you know, kidnapping you, taking you into a van, driving you to some place, assaulting you, and leaving you. People know who is raping them. And that's, so it's in fact this acquaintance rape that is really, to my mind, I want to kind of have you hold that out there as a maybe point around service provision. They're not your partner. They're not someone that you're in an intimate relationship with or married to, like marital rape or intimate partner violence, but they're not a stranger. It's someone you know. It's someone that you're at university with. It might be a coworker. This is the one that I think we have to kind of keep our eye on in terms of why we still need separate and robust sexual assault services, because how we respond to this is going to be different than the marital rape in terms of coming from an IPV and domestic violence framework. Now, as far as the rates of sexual violence in domestic violence circumstances, we know that it's about 80%. Women will say, except they don't want to say, my husband raped me. It's very, very hard for women to say, my husband raped me. But frontline workers will say, oh yeah, so he did this to her, and then he did this to her. And so a lot of our research in terms of what we know about the rates of marital rape come from some self-disclosure in victim stories and survivor stories, but really from studies of frontline workers who say, oh yeah, the client base I see have all this happening to them, and it's inclusive of sexual violence. So we know it's a really high rate of coercive sexual activity, rape or sexual assault, happening within marriages and within cohabiting relationships. And this is why I think we need to at least have a discussion going forward about, well, what should research and programming around domestic and family violence look like? We got to include the sexual violence part because this is a huge overlap and it's a huge issue for us. I just put this up here. I mean, I can actually just give you the slides if you want. This comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics in terms of the definition that you're using in your own country for sexual assault and abuse. And, you know, again, it's kind of, a lot of it is very much directed towards what's happening actually to the body. So that's similar to the way that we've thought a lot about domestic violence for a long time. But I think it's good that it's inclusive now of the way new technologies are used to become a form of sexual assault that may not even ever touch the body itself. So that's kind of the more structural sexual violence, as opposed to maybe when we talk about the interpersonal or bodily experience of sexual violence. The way that pornography in particular, digital pornography, and so we're including in our survey questions around that to see how often, you know, just the way that your smartphone can be used as a force of violation. So that'll be useful. But again, this is a lot to read, so I'll just make sure I leave that slide if you guys want this definition. So one of the things that I think that a lot of things that these definitions are trying to do, which I think are really, really good, is to shift the way from individuals. Like it's the bad apple, it's the individual pathology, he was just being a lad, you know, that kind of language to, okay, what is it about the wider society and the institutions themselves that perpetuate these forms of violence? So that gets back to that UN definition of the causes of and the consequences of gender inequity more broadly. And I think that is actually really useful. I would hate for us to become so structurally focused that it really just stays theoretical, but I think that it's important to see that, I mean, any of us who have worked in service provision or done research, we know like there's not just one perpetrator and there's not just one victim. Like something is going on that's bigger than just, someone who made, bad decisions in how they treated someone and someone who experienced those bad decisions, right? So I think that this is probably where sociology and anthropology have been really good partners to psychology, because psychology had really stayed very much kind of individual focused, and sociology was much more kind of social focused. And I think these made a nice marriage in terms of trying to think more structurally about how we think about violence and think about these experiences. You will still see, though, the way that we frame acts of violence, we tend to blame individuals in the US and even in Australia. We don't say the Australian culture makes battering happen. We say, oh, this bloke who did this, or this lad who did this. And that's particularly for people who are white. We tend to assume white people, again, because white people don't have culture, white people can't have cultural drivers for their behavior. But if you're not white, culture drives you to do things, right? So that's, again, that way that kind of thinking about culture reinforces these stereotypes of, oh, it's their religion that makes them do it, or it's their, their tribal culture, or it's their belief system, as somehow whites don't have those things too. So we very much have the bad apple phenomenon in the United States. So rape is rife in fraternity culture in the United States, right, in American universities. But somehow there's just a lot of bad apples, and you want to get that structural approach and say, what is going on in these institutions that make it think okay for men to do this to women, with the hazing, with the kind of hyper-masculinity that's being, kind of performed and perpetuated, as opposed to just like, how is it that you get like all these bad individuals in one club? Like, that can't be what's really going on. So I think that this shift is really important. And I think that journalism, Colleen was telling me that the R-Watch website, I guess, has a really good media guide in terms of getting journalists to reframe this differently so that they themselves are not perpetuating their reporting, oh, it must be because of their religion that they did it, as opposed to their, white people have beliefs too that drive them to act in certain ways. So I think that that's really important. You will always see, not in places like the US or Australia, anytime you see anything about violence against women in a what we used to term the third world or in poorer countries, it is always blamed on culture, always. There's always like their backward cultural beliefs, their traditions. You'll often see traditions used in the title, and that's their way of saying like, oh, if only these countries would develop, if only they would get democracies and become more like the West, then these problems would go away. Hugely problematic. So I would say that the structural violence approach has been useful for us thinking through that. What are women's disadvantaged economic positions? It's different in different places, but what are they? What's the state's role in maintaining and exacerbating violence? I think that's really important to look at. And how has the discrimination in particular been against sexual and gender minorities? And so that structural violence approach, I think those are three things that can be useful in a programmatic approach and in a research approach. I think these are structural things that should be incorporated and looked at, even if you're taking a more individually focused approach. Now, one of the things that gives me hope is Peggy Sandys' work. So Peggy Sandys is an anthropologist, and at the time that she started doing her work around 40 years ago on this topic, well over 40 years ago, a lot of the explanations around why rape and domestic violence happen are because men are just biologically that way. Like, men have biological urges, ergo they have these sexual urges, ergo that's why they rape, because women aren't, somehow women don't have biological needs around sex, but men do, and so there's this incompatibility on the sexes, not the genders, the sex, the biological sex differences, and that's why they're abusive. So, and we still have this. I mean, evolutionary psychologists still promote this idea that there's a biological basis to domestic and sexual violence. Men are just inherently more violent. It's something on the Y chromosome, right? Peggy Sandys was like, no. She was like, I'm going to prove to you that that's not the case. And so she did the most and if actually anyone wants the article, I'm happy to send it to you. Give me your email, because it's behind a paywall, so I'm happy to send it to you for free. Am I allowed to say that on the video? She had this fabulous study that she did. It's the most comprehensive study where she actually looked at 156 different societies, and she coded them for whether or not sexual assault and rape were present or not present. Now again, the flaw in this is she did the study in 1981, or it was published in 1981. She was drawing on ethnographic material that had been collected since the turn of the century. Now, I will say that from like the turn of the century up until about the 1960s, the reason that I would trust her study is that ethnographers were incredibly comprehensive. They documented everything, right? So even if they weren't calling it rape, they were still coding for sexual behaviors that they were seeing and what they were hearing from people. Again, while still not trying to impose our terms on other cultures. And so she went through the Human Relations Area File, which is where all our ethnographic materials get kind of housed and archived. And she looked at 156 different societies around the world. She tried to figure out what are the factors that mitigate against rape. So what is it that you might find in a culture where you don't see sexual violence? And then what were the factors that actually were making rape and sexual assault very prominent? Why was it kind of part of the everyday life? Now her findings compared to current data, the issue is at the time that she was doing her study and looking at the ethnographic material from before, largely these societies were still what we call subsistence societies. They had not yet been incorporated into the global wage labor industrial system, capitalism. And so, you know, since in the 40 plus years since she published this, a lot of those societies have changed. I mean, there's been migration, you know, women and men have had to move into the wage labor system. I mean, these cultures have fundamentally changed because the economic system has changed. And that has then created new forms of gender-based violence in societies that 40 years ago you didn't see rape. So I think that is interesting too, is what is it about capitalism that creates a context in which rape and domestic violence flourish, right? So I think her findings are still very useful for that. She was really she was really careful. I mean, she will use this term. She's a professor emerita and she still talks about this issue. She's really nervous about this term rape culture because I can see where she's coming from, because it can go the way of kind of the way that we use culturally specific services, as it might narrow our focus, as opposed to what she likes to talk about are cultures that maintain rape. And I actually prefer, I think I side with her on this one, that we might have a rape culture in the United States, but we're in a culture that maintains rape, right? Because it's not just the university or sports, it's the broader culture. I mean, I have a president right now who talks about sexually assaulting women openly. How is that not a culture that maintains rape? As opposed to, well, is the White House rape culture? Does that make sense? Like, I get a little bit, I see why we use the term rape culture, but I actually prefer, personally, and we can maybe talk about this, cultures that maintain rape. And so that's one of the things that she teases out. But because again, how do terms apply to the institutional structures? I like the idea of culture maintaining rape, because then you can see all the different ways that the systems, kinship systems, the family structure, gender ideologies, the military, the police, everything feeds into this kind of more overarching, holistic understanding of the ways those different institutions differently, as opposed to, the police have rape culture. I see the police, or maybe the military, as just one part of an institution that feeds into this larger ideology that creates, approval of certain types of violent acts or promotes certain types of violent acts. And so I actually like Madeline Edelman. In terms of thinking of labeling something, I like Madeline Edelman's conception of the battering state. She's done a lot of work in Israel, and so she looks at the way that Palestinian women and Israeli women and Arab Israeli women are differentially treated around violence against women by, the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli state, the Palestinian authorities, for parts that there's a little bit more autonomy away from the Israeli state, and how it is that the state itself, so she's probably the best at getting at the way those state ideologies through institutions actually do create this context of being a culture that maintains violence, a culture that maintains rape. So her work I see as very complementary. She's a fabulous scholar. Maybe someone else that the center should invite. I'll just keep giving names to Colleen and they can invite them. So I just wanted to show you how Peggy's coded her work. Again, I'm happy to send this article to anyone who wants it. So she went through, this is just an example of how she coded, how she found the types of rape, and she was comparing it to one previous study that had been done that was also looking at it in terms of where they found agreement in the coding and different. So I thought this is really good, just social science. I mean, this is just really good methodology because she's not saying like her conception of it goes. She was actually trying to compare it to other studies, which oftentimes you don't find that systematic review. And again, then if scholars aren't doing that, that weakens our argument to get the government to listen to us. So I think that I think it was really important that Sanday did this. And then she coded it. And then she had, her methodology, she explains in the article, and she goes through and shows how many different outside groups she had code it themselves to make sure that it was this kind of double-blind testing of these codes. So it was very systematic. And kind of ceremonial rape, so is it something that's done more, kind of the society promotes it, or is it more interpersonal? Rape as a weapon of war. So she had these different ways of seeing the different levels of rape and forms of rape in these different societies that she found. This shows you how she came up with her numbers. So what she coded as rape-free, you can see on the previous slide, on this one, you'll see this was just snapshots from her research. She didn't have any 2s, these were just all 1s and 3s, but she actually had 3 categories that the groupings were put into. So rape-free, rape is reported as rare as absent. 2, rape is reported as present. No report of frequency or suggestion that rape is not atypical. So those are 33 of the countries. Rape prone. So she was really trying to get at kind of more rape prone and less rape prone. Are there rape-free cultures full stop? What do they look like? What are ones like the 2, but we can't tell how frequently, there's just kind of inexact ethnographic data around those. And then the ones where we actually see a lot of rape. I find it really heartening, given that she looked at 156 different, cultures, that this is actually really small. I mean, again, that was important for the kind of biologically deterministic arguments, but it gives me hope, like, what's going on in the other societies that are mitigating against rape? Like, look, people, we can do this. These factors don't have to be present. So I find her work still incredibly relevant for what we're trying to grapple with now. So I want to just talk more practically about practice then. And so what does all this theory and kind of research mean for practice? We have domestic violence and sexual assault silos. And I think there's reasons for it, but also deeply problematic. I think when you go through the research, you realize we need to have some better overlap. And researchers have been siloed too. It's not just what you see in the practice end of it. Researchers often are like, well, I'm a domestic and family violence researcher. I don't do rape, or oh, I'm just a sexual assault researcher. I don't really deal with that domestic and family violence stuff. And I think that there's both benefits to it, but I think that we need to have kind of, if you want to have a Venn diagram, we need that overlap to be a lot bigger than it currently is. So in the United States, and I know here as well, domestic and family violence and sexual assault have been historically separate services, right? And I think, kind of what I'm hearing here in Australia, but also what's true in the US, is these are the poor cousins. Sexual assault and sexual violence tends to get less of the funding, less of the attention, and domestic and family violence, I think because the kids. We got the kids in the domestic and family violence, and that gets the attention. I'm going to be cynical and be like, I don't think it's the government really cares about these women more. I think it's that there's the kids, But for whatever reason, sexual violence has been the poor cousin. In the United States, we actually have different codes that keep those silos in place. The thing that's really interesting is it's not just a silo between domestic and family violence service and sexual assault. We actually have separate systems to address interpersonal violence and sexual assault. So for instance, if I'm from California, if I'm just walking down the street, in my home state, and I were to be sexually assaulted, I would have to go through the criminal justice system, right? If I were a professor on a California campus, I could use Title IX. I would use a civil, Office of Civil Rights, I would use a federal code, Title IX, to be able to get a redress on what happened to me and have the perpetrator held accountable, not through the criminal system, but through a civil system, through the Office of Civil Rights. But Title IX only applies to educational institutions. So college students, for instance, in the United States, it doesn't matter what state they're on. I mean, it's kind of like Australia where you guys have the different states, so you have state laws and federal laws. if I were to go through, in California, if I were to go through the criminal system, how that rape is coded in California is going to be completely different from Nevada and completely different from Connecticut and Texas. 50 states have 50 different laws. If I'm on an educational institution, it's Title IX. It's a federal law. So what happens in the United States, in terms of talking about campus rape, is a student can choose to either do the criminal justice system in whatever state they're in, and how it's coded and how it's dealt with, or they can do Title IX. And Title IX is a civil response versus a criminal response. And Title IX, you aren't actually raped, it's sexual misconduct. So it's even coded differently, because the way that you're held accountable as a perpetrator is you broke the student handbook, you broke the code of conduct, you didn't violate a penal code. Does that make sense? Like, so the difference. So that's its own silo. So you have this completely different system. A perpetrator can be found responsible. They're not found guilty, they're found responsible for sexual misconduct. He can transfer to another university, not on his record. So he basically escapes the entire labeling of being a sexual perpetrator, of being a, I can't think of it right now, sex offender, right? So if he had gone through the criminal system and he was found responsible, guilty, then he would have to register as a sex offender. If you're just found responsible of sexual misconduct, there's no record, right? So there's a lot of benefits to Title IX, but there's also a lot of problems. So that's its own silo that treats a population completely differently. And then the military code. In the military, say a woman is married to an officer or something, just someone who's enlisted. And they live in Colorado. They're on a base in Colorado. And he beats her or he rapes her. She can choose to either try and go through the through the criminal justice system there in Colorado or wherever, or she can try to go through the military and go through kind of the military jurisdiction. So the military and Title IX kind of operate, they're federal, so it doesn't matter if she's in Hawaii, Alaska, Colorado, this system will be federal, or even on a base overseas. So let's say she's in Japan, she wouldn't even have to go to the Japanese authorities, she could just get it resolved through the military code. That is in place because in a lot of states we've made it so that perpetrators of domestic violence, there's certain laws in certain states, not in all states, again, it's every single jurisdiction has its own laws, where they might not be allowed to have a firearm. So a lot of times the wives are pressured to go through the military system because he can't do his job as a military officer or enlisted person without a weapon. And so they don't want that prohibition against him. And also just in terms of being able to keep people in the military and be able to keep them supported. So it's its own system. So that's its own silo. So you've got layers upon layers of these different silos. Also, within some military jurisdictions, the sexual assault people are completely separate from the domestic violence people. And so you'll have these, in fact, this great study that's just being done by Sarah Hautzinger, who's at Colorado College. She's looking at the way the wives, because you have to be married to be able to live on the base if you're married to someone who's in the military. They don't know where to go if they've been raped by their husband. Like, do I go to the sexual assault people or do I go to the DV people? And which military code's going to apply? It also matters in terms of those women who are raped by their fellow service people. They have a system in place, but they are encouraged to not go outside the military jurisdiction in order to resolve those cases of rape by their colleagues, that acquaintance rape that's happening. So that's its own kind of system. The other thing that the silo has been, which I think we're all familiar with, is the very fact that you have to have like a women's strategy, right? And which I think is actually really good. We have at the UN, the UN Women. It's supposed to be the UN institution that looks at women's issues. But we worry about, the women's strategy will handle it. So then economic policy broadly for Queensland doesn't have to deal with women because the women's strategy has it. Or if we're looking at education, it can really be kind of this male, model of education because the women's strategy will handle it. And the UN worries about that a little bit with UN Women. And that, we'll just dump all the women's issues into UN Women and then UNDP and UNICEF and everything else and the Security Council, they can just deal with the other stuff. So I think that we really have to be careful about having these women-specific entities, but ensuring that gender cuts across everything and doesn't get siloed. But what we tend to find in practice, and historically you look back, and you're like, how come family was only talked about the office of women? It wasn't talked about in these other contexts. It shows you a little bit that it gets siloed. So I think it's just important to be thinking about that in terms of our service provision as well. Funding, I probably don't need to tell anyone about, funding. One of the arguments for why having these silos to women's issues and putting women all into kind of one group is that funding can all go to that entity. Great, you tend to find that it's actually less funding. Like it's fewer dollars that then go to that entity than the other institutions, and yet there was more money for issues that might be women's issues when it cut across the different sectors. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of how the funding impacts women's lives. You also have different government agencies addressing different aspects of the problem. I mean, we were just talking this morning about how, okay, so you've got the Department of Communities, and they've got their domestic violence, kind of focus. You've got the Department of Health, you've got Department of Education, Department of Corrections. Everyone's dealing with this issue of violence, but then they're all using different models, different types of personnel, at different levels, and how do you coordinate it? So you can see why it's so attractive to try to just have it in one, kind of one funding stream and kind of one government institution. But then you see when that does happen, the issue drops off in the other one. So kind of having that balance is really, really tricky. I have no solutions for you. I'm just like presenting, something I think we need to think about. So here's some issues that we face in terms of the practicality of consolidation versus separate services. It's about power. I mean, there is a historical legacy to sexual violence and domestic violence being separate. There's also really, really powerful individuals associated with those institutions. And not everyone likes each other. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to these kind of community meetings, or, I mean, it's true in research too, like, there are big egos, there's a big investment, and people think they're right. People operating in sexual violence services do have a different ideology around gender and society than a lot of the people in the domestic and family violence services. And you think you're right. And those powerful, just really stroppy individuals who are there, who have built their lives around these services, it's really hard to say, well, we think you should work together, and you're going to lose a little bit of power. So I think that it's worth starting to have that conversation in a way that's respectful of those. These are people who are forces of nature. To keep fighting for these vulnerable populations and for fighting for these ideologies, that shouldn't be discounted. But I think that it has been at the disservice of really thinking through how these two issues are not separate. And so how do we bring people to the table while respecting the individual strengths that they bring and the histories that they bring? No one likes to do power sharing. We talk a lot about co-design and collaboration. Guess what? Power just seems to be this power. Foucault was right. Power is everywhere, and yet you can't figure out where to place it. So, and power, if you really think about the definition of power, it just means the capacity to influence. I mean, that is the basic definition of power. And those people want to influence. Again, they have their ideas in their head about what gender is and what rape is and what violence is, and they want their influence over then how the programs work. So if they're incompatible, so actually that's why I think it's so important to arm, frontline workers with not just, this is what you should do, here's your checklist, here's your safety planning, this is how you respond to a woman, but actually have frontline workers aware of the ideologies that are operating in their services so that they're aware of those power differentials. They often think in terms of power of the man versus the woman, but power is operating in their kind of community collaborations as well, and there are different ideologies at play. Let's empower our frontline workers to know what those ideologies are so that they can better think about, okay, well then how do we talk to one another? How do we maybe find common ground? I think that is so important. Money. I mean, it's the capacity to influence, but it's also money. You want to influence because you want money. And you're desperate for the funding because you care about the people who work for you and you care about your colleagues, right? Or you think your research plan is better than everyone else's, and so you want the research funding. So, money ruins everything and money alivens everything. I mean, that's the reality. And I think that I have noticed that the frontline workers do talk a lot about money and conflicts over money, and so I think that's a good thing. And so I think it's about, well, here's $1, and you want influence with this dollar. In fact, 60% of what you and the domestic violence worker and the sexual assault worker, 60% of your ideology is shared. So 60 cents of this dollar. Is there a way we could better use that in that shared area of common ideas, right? So I think that you can think that ideology through money in new ways to have these better responses. The laws also not just variable in terms of how we treat domestic and family violence differently from sexual assault, but also the laws from state to state. So we again have the problem like you guys where you have different jurisdictions, there's federal law and there's state laws, and it can feel with something like sexual assault and domestic and family violence that they're in fact contradictory to each other. We have 50 of them. I mean, so it's just the magnitude of trying to suss out, why is rape treated differently in Connecticut than it is if you drive 1 minute away to Rhode Island? You'd be treated with a completely different set of laws, and that's a problem itself. The experience that people have, and this is where I really want to be, and it goes with the known and unknown. This is what I was talking about, to be really conservative, those 20% of sexual assault victims and survivors who it's an acquaintance or it's the unknown person. I really do believe that experience is very different from the IPV experience. And so I think we need to be really sensitive to maintaining a focus on that form of sexual assault and where you do need specialized knowledge and treating that separate from the relationship dynamic that had sexual assault as part of it. Does that make sense? I mean, so I think that we can't just say, oh, like sexual assault and DVF should work together because it's all about gender-based violence. No, that experience of stranger or acquaintance rape is itself something that we need to kind of keep. What do specialized services, or even for adults who were abused in childhood, they know who their perpetrator was. They're not perpetrating sexual assault themselves, but their adult experiences from that sexual violence, that itself needs its own kind of thinking through and support. That's not IPV in terms of what they're experiencing in the contemporary. So these are the kinds of things that I think we can acknowledge where there's different types of experiences at different points in time of someone's life, but what's the bulk that really does hold together? There is a center here, and how do we hold it? How do we hold it together? What kind of supports are in place? I'll give the example of, I worked at an NGO a long time ago in San Diego where we were the Women's Resource Center, and we were domestic violence and sexual assault. So when I was trained, so in the United States it used to be 40-hour training for domestic violence, and it was like a 30-hour training for sexual assault. For those of us who worked in kind of these holistic agencies, it was 72 hours of training. So you learned sexual assault alongside domestic violence, you did the domestic violence hotline, but you also were the sexual assault response team person who would go to the hospital for a forensic examination. So, I would say that there were definitely benefits from knowing all those forms of violence against women that probably made me a better researcher when I focused, for instance, on frontline workers who did domestic violence services. I came out of this understanding of the ways that they were related. So I actually think rethinking training around how do you learn what violence against women is, and then where are the special needs along, domestic violence, family violence, sexual assault. But that's why I think the kind of broader framing is really useful, because it helps you think about what kind of support you're capable of giving and what kind of supports the frontline workers need for the problems they're facing. Okay. I was just going to say that marital rape to me is a thing that helps us kind of pull this all together. Again, when I was talking about the fact that so many women, we think about 80% will have experienced some kind of sexual violence in their intimate personal violence relationships. But the reason it was unrecognized, and I'll just do this really quickly, is Australia, you guys made it illegal federally in 91, we made it illegal in 93. I'll just really quickly talk about this. Marriage, when we think about marriage, and this is true actually in a lot of societies, not all societies, but a lot of societies, you think about what is it in marriage that you do in marriage that you don't do with anyone else, right? You can go bowling with a coworker. You can go do yoga with your sister. You can go to a book club, with your brother-in-law. You're not supposed to have sex with anyone else. The sexual exclusivity that religion has reinforced. I mean, we have a whole set of institutions that reinforce this idea. Why would it then not make sense to people that the one thing you get in marriage and that you're entitled to, that you don't get from anyone else, is sexual access? What else do you do in marriage that you don't do with anyone else? Right? If you think about it, in terms of kind of like your day-to-day activities, you eat with other people, you share money with other people, right? You might like be a business partner with someone else, right, who you're not having sex with. But sex is, you even raise kids with other people in some contexts, right? But you don't have sex with other people. And so part of the reason I think we really have to have, at a practical level, a more robust discussion around this idea of sexual access and sexual exclusivity as an expectation and a right. Men absolutely think they have a right to your body when they're married to you. And same-sex couples actually have these beliefs too. So that's why I think it's so tricky, because it's a behavior that's expected in a relationship. So how can you say no to me? Like, you can say no to the friend to go to yoga or the book club, but like, this is the whole reason for the marriage contract, is I'm supposed to have sex with you and no one else. Does that make sense? I mean, so that's why I think it's culturally, we don't like to think about it, but that for me is the sticking point that we need to suss out. I am probably not going to I'm going to skip over this really quick, because I just want to end on this in terms of thinking about this integration. I think I've thrown out more to you, kind of more questions that I think we need to work through, but I think that, if you look at this overlap, what QCDF, I can't say your acronym yet, your CIDFR, is working on, is like, how do you see this integration in a holism? This is not the way you do a Venn diagram, like what I'm going to show you. I actually think this would go a lot more in here. Does that make sense? And then you'd still have this part of sexual violence, as I said, that's specialized. But this almost would entirely be overlapped. And that is where we need to rethink our training and our services. I mean, sexual violence is just rife in domestic violence, And then you're going to have a little bit right here that would be those women and men who tell you, like, well, he never hit me. He just was gaslighting me, and then there's a way of, but the people who are trained to deal with that are also working with the cases where there's the marital and relationship rape happening, right? And then there's the people who, as I said, were trained to deal with the acquaintance rape or the stranger rape, which I think do have those, or the child abuse experience that you want to talk about in adulthood. I think those still need to be, and that's when they talk about the importance to maintain those specialists, but how do we better consolidate? And so, like, the applied research, I would just say is, and I'm going to skip through this because I'm cognizant of time. Colleen's giving me like this big scary teeth. Is that this is the part that I think in research and in practice that we're working. If you look at Amrose's model is really good about how do research inform workers, how do workers inform research, and then how does that inform policy? To me, the missing piece is the worker-to-worker, peer-to-peer research. This is critical. And maybe I'm biased towards this because I've done so much work with frontline workers. And I think they're informing each other all the time of ideas and new things. It just never filters anywhere. So I actually think in this field in particular, if you were to sit down sexual assault people and domestic violence frontline workers, not the powerful, kind of figures of the movements, you get those frontline workers together. I actually think in this field in particular, this peer-to-peer model could be really, really informative to us, not just in practice and policy, but in research as well. I think there's a lot of shared knowledge there that's already happening, and it's missing from kind of our model of research to practice to policy, is that peer-to-peer part. So I think that that's something that, and also using more workers as our researchers. I think that that is critical, is trying to convince the government that there needs to be space for this because of this overlap, particularly in these fields, and what they can tell us about what they're seeing, and helping us to define the problem. So that just gets to my point about, what's the value of the frontline labor, that really, they have the stories to tell us. We just need to do a better job of capturing them. The fact that they're completely invisible. You never go to any of these kind of big meetings or even in research settings and have those frontline workers, the person who's answering the hotline, sitting there informing you of what they're experiencing. So how do we get them more visible and get them more in these peer-to-peer contexts to share their knowledge? At the same time, they will ask us, they want upskilling. They want to learn the latest theories. They want to learn the latest training. They want education too, but there's a lot of education that's not coming, parallel, and it's not coming up. And I think that that's the real problem. So I hope that gave you some food for thought or ideas.
Okay. I'm very much in line with thinking about this kind of specialism we put around sexual assault and that kind of stuff, and I take your point about having to maintain some division between the two, but I think that the idea of sexual violence, we put it in this particular kind of bubble, and it has to have specialist researchers and clinical psychologists to deal with it. It's another form of violence. It's a particularly invasive and intrusive form of violence, but it's part of the same continuum. I wonder if you think that the notional sexual violence within domestic and family violence will collapse. In as much as when we talk about sexual violence, we don't think of sexual activity. We tend to think of a mutuality. And this isn't about mutuality at all. Mm-hmm. And I mean, part of my background is working with sexual offenders, and we use this term grooming, which is a really odd term. It's what, you're an anthropologist. What chimpanzees do to each other too, but this, it's not grooming, it's sexual, it's entrapment, it's predatory entrapment. And I wonder if you think that maybe that kind of category might start to collapse really.
See, I don't, so again, that's why I think, it would be really useful. I almost feel like we need to go back over 40 years of data that we have from frontline workers and to rethink all those previous studies with this new way of thinking in mind to kind of see what we missed. Honestly, I mean, I really do think, that's what Peggy Sandys did and looking back and all that ethnographic
very thorough, isn't it?
Research, trying to mine it for, okay, what was actually happening. Because, and I think this is where from a programmatic or a service delivery or even kind of government institution where we have a problem, because what isn't gender-based violence? Right? So so let's collapse sexual violence into domestic family violence, and you've got a one-size-fits-all service center.
Right.
Bad stuff happens to you, come to the Mackay Women's Bad Stuff Happens to You Center, right? So, but then you have this kind of very specific behavior of the sexual predator who's knowingly targeting someone. I mean, I'm just thinking of the way that priests have done this, right?
Sure.
That is different behavior than what the husband's doing to his wife. But from a gender-based violence standpoint, it's all gender-based violence, right? It's all some form of violence that's happening to an individual. So should any specialist in that center be able to deal with both the priest who, first you can be the altar boy, and now you can help me, prepare the special services, and the way that kind of bringing that, or what teachers have done, right? With this, and should he be in the same group as the guy who's raping his wife? Do you see what I'm saying? Sure, from that big macro perspective, that's all gender-based violence. But what would the specific treatment needs or even kind of social response be to what that priest or teacher is doing differently from the husband, and the wife who wants to maintain that relationship, she just doesn't want him to rape her? Does that make sense?
Sure.
I mean, I'm not really. So that's where I try to say,
make the distinction. Yeah.
What is it workers would tell us that they actually think would be the most useful for that?
I'd like to have more discussion, but I won't do it here because
no,
I
but
think,
sure,
I take your point.
I mean, I'd love to know what you're thinking from your own research or practice backgrounds in terms of where you see overlap or you don't think it would work, or it's all bad and we just need to address it. Which I think is problematic with kind of the broader framing. I agree with it theoretically, but I think how then, how would you, in schools, how would you address gender-based violence in school? You'd say everything is problematic. All institutions are bad. You know, like, is that really going to be useful in terms of how we think about changing community attitudes when there's particular behaviors that we know are being expressed in a community? So that's the issue. All right, well, I'll give you my card. If anyone wants copies of Peggy's work, it's amazing, or Madeline's work. Her stuff, too, on the battering state is really, really good. And if you think of things that you'd like to inform me.
Let me take the liberty of seeing as I started this but you know, another shimmering example really of why we encouraged Hillary to come here. It's fantastic. And I'm just kind of, it's really, I'm reinvigorated my kind of commitment to this field and listening to these kind of ideas. Sometimes I think, you know, in terms of practice and teaching, get a bit kind of ground down and think, oh, no, I can't think of anything new, and this reinvigorates, I think. So I want to thank you very much indeed for this. Hillary, again, I do feel recommitted and thinking, yeah, absolutely, this is what I want to do. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.